My husband's stepchildren pawned my junk watch collection, so I took them to court. My name is Margaret Ellison, and I learned the hard way that people don't just steal objects, they steal the memories attached to them. I never thought of myself as a collector in the flashy sense. My watches weren't diamond-studded Rolexes or high-end Omegas. They were modest, sometimes quirky pieces, each with a story, each with a memory etched into its ticking heart. There was the tiny silver watch I wore the day I gave birth to my daughter. The old brass piece my father gave me before he passed away. A battered Timex I wore through my years working at the library, its scratches almost like battle scars, each one telling me where I had been. To anyone else, these watches might look like flea market finds. But to me, they were my life, lined up neatly in velvet boxes. When I wound them, I felt time itself listening to me, acknowledging I had lived through decades of laughter, grief, endurance, and quiet victories. My husband, Richard, didn't care much for them. He'd tease me about hoarding old junk, though always with a smile. But his children from his previous marriage, 2 grown stepdaughters, and a son mocked me openly. To them, I was the odd woman who fussed over cheap watches instead of flaunting jewelry. Their smirks stung more than I let on. One evening, during a family dinner, his eldest daughter, Stephanie, ran her finger across the glass display of my watch cabinet and laughed. "Margaret, why don't you get rid of these? I'm sure the pawn shop might give you $20 for the whole lot." Her brother, Derek, chimed in. "Or maybe we should donate them to Goodwill. Someone might actually think they're worth something." They laughed, my husband chuckled uneasily, and I forced a polite smile. Inside, I burned. They didn't know that the watch she had just mocked was worth far more than $20. They didn't know that the brass timepiece once belonged to my grandfather, who'd carried it through the war. They didn't understand that the tiny silver watch had ticked beside me while I rocked my newborn daughter to sleep in the hospital. The truth was simple. To me, they weren't watches. They were chapters of my life. That night, as I carefully returned each one to its case, I whispered to them like old friends. "They don't know your stories, but I do." Still, the way Richard's children looked at me gnawed at my insides. Their contempt wasn't just about the watches, it was about me. I was an intruder in their family, a stepmother they never asked for, and mocking my junk collection was just one more way to remind me that I didn't belong. Little did I know, their disdain would go far beyond cruel laughter. Soon, it would cross into something unforgivable. The resentment from Richard's stepchildren wasn't subtle. It dripped from every comment, every smirk, every backhanded remark. If I had been naive, I might have thought they disliked only my watches, but I knew better. Their real contempt was for me. The watches were just the easiest target. Stephanie, the eldest, carried herself like she was owed the world. She was 34, twice divorced, and still living off whatever scraps her father handed her. She had a sharp tongue and the kind of false charm that fooled strangers but never fooled me. Her younger sister, Melissa, was quieter but sly. She'd watch me with those calculating eyes, as if she were cataloging every weakness I had. And Derek, the youngest at 28, was the loudest of the 3. Brash, spoiled, always trying to prove himself by tearing others down. They made me feel like a guest in my own home. One afternoon, Richard and I hosted a small barbecue in the backyard. The kind of thing I loved: good food, summer breeze, neighbors dropping by. But the moment his children arrived, that warmth thinned like smoke in the wind. I noticed Stephanie staring at my wrist. I was wearing my brass war-era watch, the one my grandfather had given me when I graduated college. "Still wearing that?" she scoffed, sipping her wine. "You know, Margaret, most women your age are wearing something a little more modern." Derek laughed. "She probably thinks it makes her look vintage." Then he leaned toward his sister and whispered loud enough for me to hear. "Or maybe just cheap." The words landed like sharp stones in my chest. Richard shifted uncomfortably. But instead of speaking up, He changed the subject. He always changed the subject. That silence was worse than their insults. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up, Melissa lingered by the patio table. She picked up one of the cheap plastic watches I wore for gardening, bright yellow, playful, not valuable at all, and turned it over in her hand. "You really keep all of these?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Yes," I answered simply. "Every single one has meaning." She smiled faintly, but it wasn't kind. "Meaning? Sure. But meaning doesn't pay the bills." I took the watch gently from her hand and walked away before my anger could show. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint tick-tick-tick of the silver watch on my nightstand. Richard was asleep beside me, breathing heavily. I wanted to wake him, shake him, ask him why he never defended me, why he let his children sneer at me in my own house, but I swallowed the words, like I always did. Over the next few weeks, the tension thickened. Stephanie joked about my collection every time she visited. Derek once called me the crazy watch lady when I refused to let him rummage through the cabinet. And Melissa, with her quiet cruelty, always found ways to remind me that I was not, and never would be, her real family. The watches, once a source of comfort, began to feel like a shield. I polished them more carefully, checked the locks on the cabinet twice, sometimes 3 times a day. I started wearing one at all times, even while cooking or gardening, as though keeping one on me could keep the rest safe. I told myself I was being paranoid, that they were mean-spirited but not cruel enough to actually do something. But deep down, in the part of me I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew better. There was a hunger in their eyes whenever they looked at the watches. Not just the hunger to mock, but the hunger to take. And one day, that hunger would find its moment. The resentment that simmered beneath their laughter wasn't harmless. It was building into something larger, something dangerous. I could feel it, like the steady winding of a spring, tighter and tighter with each visit. And I blindly, stubbornly kept hoping Richard would stop it before it snapped. But he didn't. And when that spring finally released, it would tear through everything I thought I could protect. It happened on a Tuesday morning, quiet and ordinary, in every way except one. I had gone into the study to polish the watches, something I did twice a week, a ritual of sorts. The sunlight spilled across the glass cabinet, highlighting the rows of ticking treasures inside. I reached for the key, which I kept hidden in a small ceramic dish, high on the bookshelf, exactly where it always was. But when I opened the cabinet, my heart stopped. 3 watches were gone. The empty spaces stared back at me like missing teeth. The silver watch from my daughter's birth, the brass war-era watch from my grandfather, and the Timex with the cracked face, the one I wore faithfully during my long nights at the library. Gone. For a moment, I convinced myself I must have misplaced them. Maybe I had taken them out and forgotten to put them back. My hands trembled as I checked every drawer, every box, even under the furniture. But deep down, I knew. They weren't misplaced. They had been taken. I felt a cold sweat slide down my spine as I clutched the edge of the cabinet. The watches weren't just items, they were anchors. Proof that my life had meaning. Proof that I had endured and carried love through decades. And now, pieces of that proof had been ripped away. I staggered into the living room, where Richard was sipping his coffee. 3 watches are missing, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He frowned, lowering his mug. Missing? Are you sure? Maybe you moved them? I never moved them without putting them back. They're gone. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, maybe you misplaced them. Or maybe... He stopped himself, but I knew what he was going to say. Maybe you're just imagining it. I slammed the cabinet key onto the table. Richard, I'm not losing my mind. They're gone. He sighed, clearly wanting to diffuse the moment. All right. All right. Don't panic. Maybe the cleaning lady. She doesn't even come in that room, I snapped. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Richard didn't say it outright, but the doubt was written across his face. I knew who had taken them, and I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure it out. Later that week, Stephanie came by, flaunting a new designer handbag. Got it on sale, she said breezily, though I knew better. She had no job, no steady income. Derek, meanwhile, showed off a brand new gaming console, still wrapped in plastic. Melissa suddenly had her nails done, her hair styled, her clothes sharper than usual. They reeked of sudden money, and I reeked of suspicion. That night, lying in bed, I clutched the remaining watches tighter. My breath felt ragged in the dark. It wasn't just theft, it was betrayal, deliberate and personal. They hadn't taken jewelry from a box or cash from a drawer. They had taken those watches. The ones they mocked, the ones they belittled. They knew exactly what they were doing. The next morning, I resolved to find out the truth. I visited the nearest pawn shop, my stomach twisting with each step. The man behind the counter barely looked up when I entered until I described the brass war-era watch. His eyes flickered too quick for comfort. "Can I see your receipts from the past week?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Lady, I can't just." I pulled out a photo of the watch from my phone. "This isn't just property, it's family. And if you don't cooperate, I'll bring the police here." He froze, then reluctantly opened his logbook, and there it was. My grandfather's brass watch. Sold 2 days ago by a young man named Derek. My knees almost gave out beneath me. I left the pawn shop shaking, my hands gripping the copy of the receipt like it was oxygen. My suspicion wasn't suspicion anymore. It was fact. When I got home, Richard was reading in the living room. I placed the receipt in front of him. "Look at this." He scanned it, frowning. "Derek? He wouldn't—" His voice trailed off, weak. I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. "They did, Richard. Your children stole from me. From us. And you're still making excuses." For the first time, his eyes filled with something other than doubt. But it wasn't defense, and it wasn't anger at them. It was fear. Fear of confrontation. Fear of choosing between me and his blood. I realized then, I was alone in this. The betrayal wasn't just from his children. It was from him, too. I had a choice. Stay silent, swallow the hurt, pretend it hadn't happened. Or fight for myself, even if it meant tearing the fragile threads of this family apart. And as I looked at that receipt, the ink fresh and damning, I knew which choice I would make. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of war. Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. The receipt from the pawn shop weighed heavier in my hands than any of the watches ever had. It was proof not just of theft, but of contempt. Derek hadn't pawned something meaningless to me, like a vase or a bracelet. He'd chosen one of the pieces I cherished most. That choice was deliberate, almost cruel. I sat in the study late that night, staring at the half-empty cabinet. The missing spaces glared back at me, accusing me of my own passivity. I had let their mockery go on too long. I had swallowed their disdain in the name of peace. And in return, they had stolen not just my possessions, but my dignity. The next morning, I visited 2 more pawn shops. My heart pounded as I described the watches, showing photographs I had saved over the years. At the second shop, I found it the silver watch from my daughter's birth. The pawn slip bore Stephanie's name. I felt the room spin. Derek, then Stephanie. 2 of them had taken pieces of my life and sold them like trinkets. The clerk offered me the watch back for the amount she'd been given, but I didn't buy it. Not yet. I needed evidence more than I needed comfort. By the time I returned home, I had 2 pawn receipts in my purse, proof of betrayal signed in their own hands. Richard was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, his newspaper folded neatly beside him. I placed the slips on the table. "Look, Stephanie and Derek, They both did it. He looked at the papers, his expression grim. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "I'll talk to them." Talk? My voice cracked with disbelief. They didn't break a vase, Richard. They didn't borrow money. They stole from me. They mocked me, called my collection worthless, and then went behind my back and proved just how little respect they have. Talking isn't enough. He pressed his palms against the table, his knuckles whitening. They're my children, Margaret, and I am your wife. My voice dropped to a whisper. When will you choose to defend me? He didn't answer. And in his silence, I understood. He would never choose. Not fully. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something chilling. If I didn't act, they would do it again. They'd strip the cabinet bare, pawn each piece until nothing remained. And Richard blind. Fearful Richard would keep telling me to talk to them, as though reason ever worked on greed. I couldn't rely on him. I had to rely on myself. The next day, I went back to the pawn shops, this time bringing a small notebook. I copied details, dates, amounts paid. I photographed the slips. Piece by piece, I was building a case. When I returned home, Melissa was already there, lounging on the couch with a smug little smile. "Where have you been, Margaret?" she asked sweetly. "Out hunting for more treasures?" I studied her carefully. Her nails were freshly painted, a shimmering ruby red. Her handbag was new expensive. And though I hadn't found her name on any pawn slips yet, I didn't need to. I knew she had dipped her hand into the collection too. I forced a polite smile, something like that. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "You really should let go of some of those old watches. They're just clutter, you know, not worth anything." Her words dripped like poison, deliberate, mocking. I wanted to scream, to pull the receipts from my purse and shove them in her face. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I smiled faintly and said, "Funny, Melissa. You always seem to know the value of things." Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough to confirm what I already knew. By the time she left, I was no longer angry, I was resolved. That evening, I sat at my desk, receipts spread across the wood, like cards in a game of high stakes. My heart pounded, but my mind was sharp. This wasn't just about watches anymore. This was about respect, about standing tall in a house where they had tried to shrink me. When Richard walked into the room, he glanced at the papers and sighed. "You're really going through with this?" I looked up at him. They crossed a line. "I'm not letting it go." His eyes softened, almost pleading. "If you take them to court, Margaret, you'll destroy whatever family we have left." I met his gaze steadily. "Richard, they destroyed it the moment they stole from me." He turned away, unable to argue. I sat back in my chair, staring at the half-empty cabinet once more. The watches that remained seemed to whisper to me, their ticking steady and reassuring. They had tried to strip me of my history, my memories. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't just a woman with a cabinet of watches. I was a woman who knew the value of time. And it was time for them to face consequences. Richard's silence became its own kind of betrayal. After I gathered the receipts, after I laid the evidence in front of him like stones in a graveyard, he said nothing more. He didn't rage at his children, didn't confront them, didn't even call them to account. He folded in on himself like a man too frightened to open his eyes. And so the house grew quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the quiet of abandonment, the stillness before rot sets in. I would catch him in the evenings, sitting in his recliner with the television flickering, his face slack, his eyes vacant. Sometimes I'd speak his name, but he barely responded. He was retreating inward, hiding from the ugliness, leaving me alone to hold the weight of what had been done. The stepchildren, of course, took his silence as permission. Stephanie breezed in with her expensive handbags. Derek lounged around bragging about his new gadgets. Melissa wore her ruby red nails and smiled her poisonous smile. Not one of them spoke a word about the theft. Not one showed an ounce of remorse. And Richard? He avoided the subject altogether, as though silence could erase reality. One evening, I tried again. I sat across from him at the dinner table, the stew between us growing cold. Richard, I said softly, this isn't going away. They stole from me. You saw the receipts. You know the truth. He pressed his lips together, staring at his bowl. They're my children, he murmured. I'm your wife, I reminded him. My voice cracked. When you let them take from me and then pretend it didn't happen, what does that make me in this house? Invisible? Disposable? He flinched, but didn't answer. His silence was louder than words. I went to bed that night with tears burning my eyes, but beneath the sorrow was something harder, sharper, resentment. Marriage is supposed to mean partnership, protection, loyalty, but I was realizing, with every quiet dinner and every sidelong glance, that Richard's loyalty would never fully be mine. His children had carved out a permanent place in his heart, and he'd let them trample over me rather than face them. It wasn't just the theft that hurt me, it was the abandonment. A few days later, Stephanie arrived unexpectedly. She strode into the house like she owned it, heels clicking against the hardwood. Dad, I need some help with rent, she announced, tossing her handbag onto the couch. Richard looked up from his newspaper, blinking. Stephanie, I'll pay you back, she said quickly, though everyone knew she wouldn't. I watched the exchange with a sick twist in my stomach. She had stolen from me, sold off my memories for pocket money, and now she was here asking for more. Before Richard could respond, I spoke. Maybe you should return what you already took before asking for more. Stephanie froze, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me? I stood tall, my voice steady. The watches. I know it was you. I have the pawn slip with your name on it. For the first time, her mask cracked, but only for a second. She recovered quickly, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. Those worthless things? You're really going to hold a grudge over that junk? My hands trembled, but I kept my tone calm. Those worthless things meant more to me than you'll ever understand. Ugh. She smirked and turned to her father. Dad, are you really going to let her talk to me like this? Over some garbage watches? Richard's face tightened, but he said nothing. Nothing. The silence was a knife through my chest. Stephanie snatched up her handbag and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The echo rattled through the house. I turned to Richard, my eyes wet with fury. You let her insult me in our home. Again. And you said nothing, Mo. He lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his features. But still no words, no defense. I realized then that I had been waiting for him to be someone he would never be, a man who stood up for me. A man who chose his wife over his children's cruelty. That man didn't exist. And if I wanted justice, if I wanted to protect myself, I would have to find it without him. That night, I locked the study door and placed the remaining watches in a fireproof safe. As I turned the key, a cold clarity settled over me. Richard could pretend nothing happened. His children could mock me, dismiss me, treat me like I was nothing. But I knew the truth. I had the receipts. I had the evidence. And when the time came, I would not stay silent. They thought I was weak, a sentimental fool clinging to junk. But they were about to learn what happens when you underestimate a woman who has already lost too much. The house felt colder after Stephanie's outburst, though the summer heat outside pressed against the windows. Richard withdrew deeper into himself, his silence now a permanent fixture. I no longer expected him to defend me. I no longer asked. Instead, I turned my energy towards something more productive evidence. I began quietly, almost obsessively, documenting everything. Each pawn slip I had copied was tucked into a binder, neatly labeled with dates, names, and shop locations. I wrote down what each watch meant to me. The silver one at my daughter's birth, the brass one from my grandfather, the cracked Timex from my library years. I wanted a record not just of theft, but of significance. A judge, I told myself, needed to see not just stolen goods, but stolen history. Every morning, after Richard left to run errands or doze in his recliner, I drove to another pawn shop. Some clerks resisted at first, but I learned how to lean on them firm voice, unwavering eye contact, the suggestion that police involvement would complicate their day. Piece by piece, I gathered what I needed. By the end of 2 weeks, my binder was heavy with proof. Derek's name appeared on 3 slips, Stephanie's on 2, Melissa's finally on 1. Together, they had stripped me of 7 watches in total. 7 fragments of my life sold, for their pocket change. The realization should have crushed me, but instead, it hardened me. One afternoon, I returned home to find Melissa in the living room again, flipping through a magazine as though she lived there. She looked up, her lips curling. "Where've you been, Margaret? Running errands? Or maybe crying over your precious watches?" I set my purse down and met her gaze steadily. "You should be careful, Melissa. The things we take in life have a way of catching up with us." "Ooh." She blinked, thrown off by the firmness in my voice. Then she laughed lightly. "You sound dramatic. They're just watches." I smiled faintly. "So you keep telling yourself." Her laughter faltered. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. That evening, I spread the binder across my desk. Each slip, each photo, each note of sentimental value stared back at me. It looked less like a scrapbook and more like a case file, a case I was prepared to bring into the open. Richard entered the room, hovering in the doorway. His eyes flicked to the binder. "You're really collecting all this?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said without hesitation. He rubbed his temple. "Margaret, if you go through with this, if you take them to court, it'll tear us apart." I closed the binder with a snap. "Richard, they already tore us apart the moment they stole from me. This is just me refusing to pretend it didn't happen." And his shoulders sagged. For a moment, I thought he might argue further. But he simply turned and left. His retreat didn't sting this time. I no longer sought his approval. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Sitting in that office, I felt my nerves tighten. The lawyer was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, her desk lined with neat stacks of files. I laid the binder before her, opening it to the first pawn slip. She listened quietly as I spoke, flipping through the documents, occasionally nodding. When I finished, she tapped her pen against the desk. "You have strong evidence," she said finally. "Theft, documented sales, receipts with their names. It's clear-cut. The law will be on your side." Her words steadied me, but then she added, "Are you prepared for what this means, though? Once you file, this becomes public. It'll pit you directly against your stepchildren, and by extension, your husband. Are you ready for that kind of fracture?" I hesitated, but only briefly. "They fractured this family long ago. I'm just shining a light on it." The lawyer smiled faintly. "Then we'll proceed." Walking out of that office, clutching the folder she gave me, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I was no longer powerless. Heavier because I knew this path would leave scars no verdict could erase. That night, I sat in the study once more, staring at the watches that remained. Their ticking was steady, unwavering, almost reassuring. I ran my finger along the glass of the cabinet and whispered, "They thought you were worthless, but you'll be the proof of their downfall." The following days blurred into preparation. Meetings with my lawyer. More documentation. Quiet determination. I no longer flinched when the stepchildren visited. Instead, I observed them calmly, as though already preparing for the witness stand. Derek swaggered in one evening, boasting about a new stereo system. He caught my eye and smirked. "What's the matter, Margaret? You look like you're plotting something." I smiled politely, my voice smooth. "Maybe I am." His laugh was loud and careless, but for the first time, It didn't sting me. He had no idea what storm was coming. The more I prepared, the stronger I felt. The frightened, silent woman who once polished her watches in secret had given way to someone sharper, steadier, and unwilling to be dismissed. They had underestimated me. That would be their undoing. And as I closed my binder one last time before the court filing, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: power. The morning I filed the case, the air felt different, sharp, electric, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I carried the folder with both hands, my grip firm, my steps measured. It wasn't just paper inside. It was months of humiliation, silence, and betrayal pressed into evidence. The clerk at the courthouse stamped the documents without ceremony, sliding them back across the counter. Just like that, it was official. My stepchildren were about to face me, not as their stepmother, not as a woman they could mock in her own home, but as their accuser. When I left the courthouse, the sun hit my face, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. But at home, the storm was waiting. Richard was in the kitchen when I walked in. He glanced at the folder in my arms, his jaw tightening. "You did it," he said flatly. "Yes," I answered. "I filed." He rubbed his forehead, his voice low. "Margaret, how could you? They're my children." I set the folder on the table and met his eyes. "And they're thieves, Richard. They stole from me. They treated me like I was nothing, and you stood by and let it happen. If you won't defend me, then I'll defend myself." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or sorrow. But then he turned away. "You've just declared war on this family." "No," I said quietly. "They declared war the moment they pawned my life away." Word spread faster than I imagined. Within days, the stepchildren knew. Stephanie called first, her voice sharp, trembling with fury. "You're taking us to court? Over those worthless watches?" "They weren't worthless to me," I said evenly. She laughed bitterly. "You've lost it, Margaret. You're nothing but a bitter old woman trying to ruin us." The line went dead before I could respond. Derek showed up in person, pounding on the door until I opened it. His face was red, his fists clenched. "You think you're clever, huh? Taking me to court? Do you know what this will do to Dad? Do you know what you did to me?" I shot back, holding his gaze. "You stole from me, Derek. I have the receipts. You wrote your name on them. You might swagger and shout, but you can't erase your own signature." His jaw tightened. For once, he had no retort. He stormed off, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. Melissa was the quietest, but her cruelty slipped in through whispers. She sent me a message late one night. "You'll regret this. Families don't survive court battles." I stared at the words on my phone and whispered to myself, maybe that's the point. The days leading up to the first hearing were tense. Neighbors whispered. Friends looked at me with raised eyebrows. Even my own daughter called, her voice cautious. "Mom, are you sure you want to do this? It's so public." I told her the truth. "They need to know that I won't be trampled. If I let this go, what message does that send? That I can be stolen from, mocked, and silenced. Number, I'd rather stand alone in court than stay silent in this house." When the day of the hearing arrived, I walked into the courtroom with my binder in my arms. The room was stark, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, wooden benches creaking as people shifted in their seats. Richard sat on one side, his children clustered around him like a fortress. Their eyes were daggers. But I didn't flinch. My lawyer sat beside me, her presence a steady anchor. "Stay calm," she whispered. "The evidence will speak louder than they can." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. My heart hammered in my chest, but I lifted my chin. The proceedings began with formalities, then shifted quickly to testimony. Derek was called first. He swaggered to the stand, trying to mask his nerves with bravado. "Mr. Ellison," the lawyer began, Can you explain how your name appears on this pawn receipt for a brass pocket watch dated 2 weeks ago? Derek glanced at the slip, his jaw tightening. That's not mine. Must be a mistake. Your signature matches this driver's license, does it not? She pressed. His face reddened. Maybe I pawned something else, but it wasn't her watch. The lawyer lifted a photograph. Is this the same watch your stepmother described in detail? The same one you signed for? The silence in the room was damning. Derek stammered, but his bravado cracked. The judge's eyes narrowed, and I felt the smallest flicker of vindication. Stephanie was next. She tried charm, smiling sweetly, her voice laced with practiced innocence. Your Honor, Margaret is exaggerating. Those watches were clutter, practically worthless. I thought I was doing her a favor. By selling them without her consent? The lawyer interrupted smoothly. Stephanie faltered, her smile slipping. Melissa never even made it to the stand that day. Her name, her pawn slip, her fresh manicure, all of it hung in the air, waiting for its moment. Through it all, Richard sat stiff, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't look at me once. As the hearing ended, the judge scheduled a continuation. More evidence to be reviewed, but I didn't leave discouraged. I left with my head high. For the first time, they had been forced to face the truth publicly. Their lies, their arrogance, their mockery, it all began to crumble under the weight of receipts and signatures. Walking out of the courthouse, I took a deep breath of the cool air. My hands trembled. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was power. They thought they could take from me and laugh in my face. But now, they would learn the weight of consequence. And I would not stop until every tick of justice had sounded in my favor. After the first hearing, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a battlefield. Richard and I barely spoke. When we did, his words came slow and heavy, as if each one cost him something he wasn't willing to give. I could feel him retreating deeper into the shell of neutrality, pretending that silence meant peace, when in truth his silence was a choice, one that left me standing alone against his children. But the silence in my house was nothing compared to the noise outside it. Stephanie, Derek, and Melissa launched their counterattack, not in court, but in whispers, rumors, and carefully crafted stories. It started with a neighbor knocking on my door one afternoon, holding a basket of cookies. She smiled kindly, but her eyes carried something else, pity. Margaret, dear, I just wanted to check on you. I heard that you were suing the children over some old watches. Her words were coated with sympathy, but the sting was real. Yes, I answered plainly. They stole from me. The neighbor blinked, surprised by my bluntness. She mumbled something about hoping things worked out and left quickly. But I knew where the story had come from. Stephanie had a talent for twisting reality. She painted herself and her siblings as victims, insisting that I was greedy, vindictive, and obsessed with junk. She told anyone who would listen that I was tearing the family apart over worthless trinkets, and worst of all, that I was dragging their father through humiliation. Derek added fuel by bragging to his friends in town. I overheard snippets at the grocery store. Yeah, Margaret's lost it, suing family over garbage. His voice carried through aisles, sharp enough to slice through my composure. Melissa was subtler. She leaned on her quiet charm, whispering to mutual acquaintances that I was unstable, that grief over my past had driven me to extremes. She never raised her voice, but her poison spread farther than Derek's shouts ever could. The result was the same: eyes following me in church pews, murmurs behind my back in the market, even old friends calling with cautious voices, asking if I was all right. I held my head high. But inside, it cut deep. One evening, I confronted Richard. He was sitting in his recliner, the television casting flickering light over his face. Your children are poisoning the town against me, I said. They're making me out to be the villain while they sit on stolen property. And you say nothing. He closed his eyes, as though my words were knives. Margaret, I can't control what they say. I stepped closer, my voice shaking with fury. You could tell the truth. You could tell people they stole from me. You could tell them you saw the receipts with your own eyes. But you won't. You'd rather let me carry the weight alone. His silence was confirmation. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick-tick of the watch on my nightstand. Each tick felt like a reminder. I was running out of patience. But even as the rumors spread, I clung to one truth: the courtroom didn't run on gossip. It ran on evidence. And evidence I had in abundance. The second hearing approached, and with it, my resolve sharpened. My lawyer advised me to stay calm, to let their arrogance undo them. The louder they mock you outside, the weaker they'll look inside, she said. She was right. At the courthouse, Stephanie tried her performance again, tears this time, painting herself as the daughter of a cruel stepmother. Derek muttered angrily under his breath, his frustration bubbling over when the lawyer presented yet another pawn slip with his signature. Melissa stayed quiet, but her eyes betrayed her guilt when the judge mentioned her name. Each time they tried to wriggle free, the receipts dragged them back down. Each excuse fell flat. Each denial contradicted the ink on the page. And yet, even as I watched their confidence falter, I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. After the hearing, as we filed out into the hallway, Melissa brushed past me, her whisper sharp as a blade. You're destroying this family, Margaret. You think you've won, but you'll be alone when this is over. I stopped, letting her words hang in the air. Then I turned to her, my voice calm but cold. Better alone with the truth than surrounded by liars. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she turned and walked away. That night, I sat in my study again, binder open, watches gleaming faintly behind the glass of the cabinet. My hand rested on the receipts, the ink fading slightly from repeated handling. They thought they could shame me into silence. They thought gossip would outweigh truth. But they underestimated me again. This wasn't just about watches anymore. This was about respect. About dignity. About standing in a world that wanted me small and quiet. I whispered to the watches, to the memories they carried. I won't let them erase you. I won't let them erase me. And as I closed the binder and locked it away, I felt it again, the slow, steady beat of determination. Rumors could wound, but truth would cut deeper. And soon, everyone judge, neighbors, even Richard would see it for themselves. The day of the courtroom showdown felt like the world had slowed its breath. The courthouse loomed over me as I stepped through its doors, binder in hand. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like a clock counting down to judgment. Inside, the air was charged thick with tension, heavy with expectation. Richard sat in the front row, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. Beside him, Stephanie dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. Melissa whispered to her attorney, and Derek glared at me with the defiance of a cornered animal. I didn't sit with them. I couldn't. I took my place at the plaintiff's table, my lawyer steady by my side, her calm presence reminding me that I wasn't walking into this storm alone. The judge called the room to order, and suddenly, all the whispers, all the gossip, all the sideways glances from neighbors faded into silence. Here, there would be no pitying smiles or cruel rumors. Here, there was only evidence. The first witness was Derek. He swaggered to the stand, trying to carry the same arrogance he always wore at family dinners. But the moment the pawn slip with his name was shown, that confidence cracked. Mr. Ellison, my lawyer said, her tone razor, sharp but calm. This receipt bears your name, your signature, and your driver's license number. Do you deny that you pawned this brass pocket watch? Derek squirmed. I don't remember. Maybe it was something else. My lawyer slid a photograph across the table. Is this the same watch? The photo was clear. The brass watch, dented along the edge, the one my grandfather carried during the war. Derek swallowed hard. Yes, he muttered finally, his voice low. The sound of his admission rang louder than any gavel. Next came Stephanie. She rose gracefully, wearing a tailored suit as though she were walking into a fashion show instead of a courtroom. She smiled sweetly at the judge, her voice dripping with practiced charm. "I think this has all been blown out of proportion," she said. "Margaret hoards these things junk, really. I only pawned one to clear some space. I thought I was helping." "And still helping?" my lawyer asked, arching a brow. "By selling property that did not belong to you?" Stephanie faltered, her smile stiffening. "It wasn't worth much. Hardly anything, really." "Then why pawn it?" the lawyer pressed. "Why sign your name to this slip if you believed it had no value?" Stephanie's eyes flicked toward her father, desperate, pleading. But Richard stared at the floor, silent. Melissa was called last. She walked slowly, her quiet demeanor making her seem almost innocent. But when her pawn slip was presented, her facade broke. I was short on rent," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think she'd notice. She has so many." Her words, soft and pitiful, hung in the air. But they didn't lessen the sting. One by one, they had confessed, whether through arrogance, charm, or quiet defeat. And as I sat there, binder closed in my lap, I felt something rise in me, not triumph, not quite, but vindication. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Ellison, do you wish to make a statement?" I rose slowly, my hands steady, my voice clear. "Your Honor, those watches may not look valuable to anyone else. But each one carried a piece of my life. They mocked me for keeping them, but they were wrong, they weren't junk. They were memories. They were love. They were time itself, ticking through everything I endured. And these children didn't just steal objects. They stole my dignity, my trust." The courtroom was silent. Even Richard finally lifted his head, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Shame, perhaps, or sorrow too late to matter. I took a deep breath and continued. "This case isn't about money. It isn't even about watches. It's about respect. It's about proving that you can't strip someone of their history and walk away laughing." The judge nodded gravely, then announced that a verdict would be rendered after review of all evidence. The gavel struck, and just like that, the session ended. As people shuffled out, Derek muttered curses under his breath. Stephanie clung to her father's arm, and Melissa avoided my eyes altogether. I walked out alone, binder tucked under my arm, my head held high. The sunlight outside was blinding, but it felt like clarity. I wasn't naive. I knew this fight wasn't over. The verdict still loomed ahead, but for the first time, they had been forced to face their actions in the light of truth. And that was a victory in itself. Standing on the courthouse steps, I whispered to myself, almost like a vow, "How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone?" The next hearing arrived with a heaviness that settled into my bones. It wasn't just another day in court, it was the day Richard would be called to the stand. I had spent weeks preparing myself for this moment, rehearsing what it might feel like to hear his words under oath. But no amount of preparation could shield me from the ache of knowing he would be torn between me and the children he had raised. When I walked into the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. My stepchildren sat huddled together, whispering and glaring, their resentment sharp as glass. Richard sat slightly apart, his face pale, his hands trembling against his lap. He looked like a man who wished he could be anywhere else but here. The proceedings began, and one by one the testimonies rolled forward. The pawn slips, the photographs, the receipts. Each piece of evidence laid bare their guilt again and again. My lawyer's voice cut like a scalpel, clean and precise, stripping away their excuses until nothing remained but truth. Then the judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Ellison, please take the stand." The room went silent. Even the rustling of papers stilled. Richard rose slowly, his steps unsteady as he approached the witness box. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and lowered himself into the chair. For a moment, he looked at me, just a flicker, But then his eyes dropped to the table, as if he couldn't bear the weight of my gaze. My lawyer began gently. Mr. Ellison, you are the husband of the plaintiff, correct? Yes, Richard said, his voice low. And you are also the father of the defendants? Yes. She nodded. So you are uniquely positioned here, Mr. Ellison. You know both parties personally. Tell us, do you recall your wife bringing to your attention that certain watches from her collection were missing? Richard shifted in his seat. Yes. She told me. And what was your response? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought maybe she misplaced them. Or maybe it was nothing. Huh. Did you see the pawn slips she later presented to you, with your children's names clearly written on them? Richard's jaw tightened. Yes. And did you believe them to be authentic? Silence. The courtroom seemed to lean forward, waiting. Finally, Richard whispered. Yes. The word was soft, but it landed like thunder. Stephanie's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Derek muttered something under his breath, and Melissa's lips pressed into a thin, white line. My lawyer continued. So, to be clear, your wife informed you of the theft, showed you receipts with your children's names, and you believed them to be authentic. Yet you did not intervene? Richard's shoulders slumped. They're my children, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. The judge interjected, his tone stern. Mr. Ellison, this is not about what you didn't know. This is about what you did. Did you, at any point, tell your children that what they did was wrong? Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. No, he admitted finally. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Hearing him say it aloud, he hadn't defended me. Hadn't defended what was right, was both confirmation and heartbreak. My lawyer pressed gently. Do you believe now, under oath, that your wife's property was taken without her consent? Richard closed his eyes, as though the words themselves hurt. Yes. For a brief moment, the weight of his admission filled me with something close to relief. But it was short-lived. Because while his words acknowledged the truth, they also revealed his failure. He had known all along. And still, he had chosen silence. When he stepped down from the stand, he didn't look at me. He returned to his seat beside his children, who hissed and glared at him, furious at his betrayal of their lies. Richard looked smaller than I had ever seen him, trapped between the wife he had failed and the children he could no longer protect. The hearing continued with more formalities, but my mind was elsewhere. I stared at the empty spaces in my watch cabinet in my memory, at the way Richard's silence had echoed through our home. And now, even here, even when forced to speak, his words had come not from loyalty, but from obligation. When the session ended, I walked past him without a word. Stephanie hissed, "You've ruined him," as I passed. I stopped, turning to face her. My voice was calm, steady. No, Stephanie. He ruined himself when he chose silence over truth. Her face twisted, but I didn't wait for her response. I walked out of the courthouse into the open air, my chest rising and falling with the weight of everything that had been said. The trial wasn't over, not yet. But a shift had occurred. For the first time, the truth had come not just from me, but from Richard's own lips. And no matter how bitterly his children fought, they could never erase that. The day of the verdict felt heavier than any day before. I woke before dawn, lying in the still darkness, listening to the faint ticking of the watch on my nightstand. That sound, steady, faithful, had been my anchor through months of betrayal and silence. Today, I told myself, justice would either affirm that sound or drown it out completely. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress with a modest pearl brooch pinned to my collar. Not for vanity, no. I had long stopped caring what Richard's children thought of me, but because I wanted to walk into that courtroom with dignity. They had stripped me of so much already. They would not take that too. Richard sat at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in front of him. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture slouched. For a moment, I almost pitied him. He was a man caught between two worlds, and in his cowardice, he had lost them both. He glanced up at me, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak. But as had become his habit, he said nothing. So I walked past him, grabbed my purse, and left without a word. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread in our small community, and curiosity had drawn neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers into the gallery. I could feel their eyes on me as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table. To them, this was entertainment. A dramatic story of a stepmother suing her husband's children over junk. They didn't see the history behind each watch, the decades stitched into metal and glass. Stephanie arrived in a sharp red dress, her head held high, projecting defiance. Melissa wore black, her expression soft and pitiful, as though she were the victim. Derek, as usual, swaggered in late, his tie loose, his arrogance poorly disguising his fear. And then Richard entered, alone. His steps slow, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't sit beside me. He joined his children. That choice, small, silent, cut deeper than any word. The judge entered, and silence fell. I gripped the edge of the table as the proceedings began. The judge recapped the evidence, his voice steady, deliberate. He spoke of the pawn slips, of the admissions under oath, of the undeniable proof that Richard's children had taken my property without consent and profited from it. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably. Derek scowled. Melissa lowered her head. Finally, the judge looked directly at them. This court finds the defendants guilty of theft. Restitution shall be made to Mrs. Ellison in the amount equivalent to the appraised value of the watches, with additional damages for emotional distress. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relief flooded me, sharp and overwhelming. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, was mine. But victory did not taste sweet. It tasted bitter, like ashes. Stephanie gasped audibly, turning to Richard. "Dad, are you going to let this stand?" she demanded. Her voice was shrill, breaking under the weight of her fury. Derek slammed his fist against the table, muttering curses under his breath. Melissa began to cry softly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Richard said nothing. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He looked at me once. Just once. His eyes full of something I couldn't name. Regret, perhaps, or shame. But it didn't matter. His silence had already spoken volumes. I gathered my binder, my hands steady now, my heart oddly calm. I had fought, I had stood tall, and the truth had prevailed. But as I walked past them, their glares and whispers biting at my back, I realized something. The verdict had cost me more than it had cost them. Because though I had won my case, I had lost my marriage. Outside the courthouse, reporters and onlookers swarmed. Microphones, cameras, and eager faces pushed forward. "Mrs. Ellison, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think your marriage can survive this? Were the watches really worth all this trouble?" I stopped. My binder clutched to my chest, and spoke clearly so all could hear. This was never about money. This was about respect. They stole from me, mocked me, dismissed me. Today, the court recognized that those actions have consequences. Whether my marriage survives or not, I know this. I will never again allow myself to be silenced. The murmurs rose, cameras flashed, and I walked away, head held high. That evening, back at home, the house was silent again. Richard sat in his chair, staring at the blank television screen. His children were gone, their fury trailing behind them like smoke. I placed the reclaimed watches, those the court had ordered, returned back into the cabinet. My fingers lingered on the brass one from my grandfather, on the silver one from my daughter's birth. They felt different now, heavier somehow, not because of their history, but because of the battle I had fought to keep them. I turned to Richard. Do you have anything to say? He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally whispered, I'm sorry. The words, long overdue, rang hollow. Sorry doesn't change what happened, I said softly. Sorry doesn't erase your silence. He lowered his head, tears glistening in his eyes. But I felt no satisfaction, no healing, only emptiness. I went upstairs, leaving him in the dark, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the house like the tick-tick of a clock winding down. Justice had been served. But justice does not mend hearts. I had my watches back. I had my dignity. But I had lost the man who was supposed to stand beside me. And as I lay in bed, the night pressing in around me, I realized the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes victory leaves you lonelier than defeat. The courthouse victory should have been a moment of triumph. Yet in the days that followed, the silence in my house grew heavier than ever. Richard barely spoke. When he did, it was about trivial things. The weather, the grocery list, a neighbor's dog. Never about the trial. Never about his children. Never about me. It was as if he believed that by pretending nothing had happened, he could erase the fractures running through the foundation of our lives. But the cracks were there, visible in every corner. The stepchildren stayed away, though their absence was hardly a relief. I could feel their anger circling me like wolves just beyond the tree line. Whispers reached me, still rumors passed through neighbors. Sideways glances at church. Murmurs in the grocery store. To them, I was the stepmother who had dragged her family through court over junk. They didn't see the truth. Or perhaps they didn't want to. One afternoon, while I polished the watches that had been returned, I realized something. The collection no longer felt the same. Each watch carried not only its original memory, but the weight of betrayal. The brass one from my grandfather ticked with the echo of Derek's arrogance. The silver one from my daughter's birth gleamed with the shadow of Stephanie's smirk. Even the cracked Timex bore Melissa's whispered cruelty. They were mine again, yes. But they were scarred now, just as I was. A week after the verdict, Richard finally broke the silence. He found me in the study, my hands resting on the glass cabinet. Margaret, he said softly, his voice almost trembling. I didn't look at him. Yes? He hesitated, then whispered. I don't know how to fix this. The admission hung between us like smoke. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes. You can't fix what you refuse to protect. He flinched as though struck. They're my children, he said again, the same refrain he'd clung to for months. And I am your wife, I replied, my voice firm but quiet. Your silence told me which mattered more. He lowered his gaze, his hands clasping and unclasping, as if searching for words, but there was nothing left to say. The days slipped into weeks. I filled my time with small rituals, tending the garden, visiting the library where I used to work, writing letters to my daughter. Life continued, steady but hollow. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, written in hurried script. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You may have won in court, but you'll never be family. Watch your back. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but I didn't need a signature. I knew whose words they were. For a moment, my chest tightened with fear. But then I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the binder with the pawn slips, and closed it. Let them rage. Let them seethe. They had already lost. In quiet moments, I thought of leaving, of packing a suitcase, taking the watches, and starting over somewhere else. A small apartment by the coast, perhaps, where the ticking of the waves could replace the ticking of the clocks. But each time the thought came, it dissolved just as quickly. This was my home. I had fought for it, for my place in it. Why should I abandon it now? Instead, I began to reclaim it. I opened the curtains in rooms long left dark. I rearranged furniture, painted walls, planted roses in the garden. With each act, I carved out a space that was mine, not Richard's, not his children's, but mine. Neighbors whispered still, but some began to soften. Mrs. Green from down the street brought over pie one evening, her eyes gentle. "They were wrong to take from you," she said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words warmed me more than the pie ever could. Richard remained in his silence, though I noticed subtle shifts. He spent more time in the garden, less time with the television. He lingered in doorways, watching me as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the courage. One night, as I prepared for bed, he finally whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up sooner." I paused, my hand on the lamp switch. "I know." "Oh, do you think," he asked hesitantly, "there's a way back from this?" I looked at him, at the man who had once been my partner, my companion, my comfort. I saw the weariness in his face, the weight of his silence carved into lines around his mouth. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "Some things, once broken, can't be put back together. Not the same way." His eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly, as though accepting a truth he had long avoided. The watches ticked on, steady and unrelenting. Time does not pause for grief or betrayal. It marches forward, indifferent, yet constant. I began to understand something in those days. Winning in court had given me justice, but it had not given me peace. Peace, I realized, could only come from within, from accepting what was lost, and from choosing what to carry forward. I chose to carry dignity. One evening, as I wound the brass watch, I whispered, "We survived. Not just me, but the memories stitched into each piece. They had tried to erase me, but I was still here." The stepchildren could spread rumors. Richard could hide in silence, but I was still standing, and I would not bend again. In the quiet of that realization, something inside me shifted. I no longer felt the need to convince anyone of my worth, not Richard, not his children, not the neighbors who whispered behind my back. I knew the truth, and that was enough. Perhaps the watches had always been trying to teach me that. That time does not beg for recognition, it simply exists, valuable whether or not others see it. So did I. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges, but it never erases them completely. Months have passed since the judge's gavel came down, since Richard's children stormed from the courtroom with fury etched into their faces. The town still whispers, though not as loudly now. Some still see me as the villain. Others have come to understand the truth. But I no longer flinch at their opinions. Because I have learned something vital. Peace does not come from being believed by others. Peace comes from believing yourself. I sit most mornings in my study, the light slanting across the glass cabinet where my watches rest. They tick in quiet unison, each second a reminder of what I endured, of what I refused to let be taken from me. They are not just timekeepers, they are witnesses. When I open the cabinet and hold one in my palm, I don't just remember the past. I remember the trial, the whispers, the silence of the man who should have defended me. I remember the moment I stood in court and told the world that my dignity was not junk, that I was not junk. Richard still lives here, though the space between us feels wider than the walls of our house. He moves through the rooms carefully, as though afraid of breaking what little remains. Sometimes, he lingers at the doorway of the study, watching me polish the watches. His eyes carry guilt, regret, words he still cannot speak. We exist like two strangers bound by habit rather than love. Once, that thought might have broken me. Now, it only makes me resolute. I don't hate him. I pity him. He had a chance to stand by me, to be a man of courage, and he chose silence. That silence will forever divide us more than any courtroom ruling. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him crying softly in the dark. I lie awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening. I feel no triumph in his sorrow, only the truth that choices have consequences. His children lost in court. He lost me. The stepchildren have vanished from my life entirely. They no longer visit, no longer call, no longer slip their poison into the corners of my home. Good riddance. Yet sometimes I wonder, do they still sneer at me in their private circles? Do they still tell anyone who will listen that I ruined the family? Perhaps they do. But I no longer care. Let them call me bitter, vengeful, obsessed. Let them rewrite the story to cast themselves as victims. The truth remains in ink and signatures, in pawn slips and verdicts. They cannot change that. More importantly, I know the truth. And that is enough. I have started writing again journals, mostly small essays about memory and loss. The library where I once worked has invited me to give a talk about preservation, about the way objects carry stories. I think I will accept. Perhaps I'll bring a watch with me, not as proof of theft, but as proof of survival, because that is what they are now. Symbols of survival. Not just my survival, but of love carried forward. My grandfather's bravery, my daughter's birth, my own quiet decades of work and endurance. They tried to reduce all of that to a few dollars at a pawn shop. And I proved them wrong. Sometimes I still ache. Justice, after all, does not erase wounds. There are mornings I wake and feel the old bitterness pressing at the edges of my heart. There are nights when I wonder what might have been if Richard had chosen differently, if he had stood beside me instead of shrinking into silence. But then I hear the ticking of the watches, steady, patient, relentless. And I remind myself that time moves forward whether we are ready or not. I choose to move with it. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Richard finally spoke words I had long waited for. "I failed you," he whispered, his voice breaking. I turned to him, studying the man I had once loved with all my heart. His hair grayer now, his shoulders slumped, his eyes watery with regret. "Yes," I said simply. He bowed his head. "I wish I could undo it." "You can't," I replied softly. "But you can live with the truth." He nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. And for the first time, I felt something lift inside me, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but release. I didn't need his apology to validate me. I had validated myself. I often wonder what others would have done in my place. Would they have stayed silent, swallowing the hurt for the sake of family harmony? Or would they have fought as I did, risking isolation to defend dignity? There is no simple answer. But I know this. Silence protects no one. Silence only emboldens cruelty. By standing up, by taking the matter to court, I proved something not just to them, but to myself. That I was not weak. That my memories, my dignity, my worth mattered. Even if the cost was loneliness, it was a price worth paying. Now, when I sit in the quiet of my study, I hear more than the ticking of watches. I hear resilience. I hear defiance. I hear the steady beat of a woman who refused to be erased. And though my marriage may be a hollow shell, though my stepchildren may despise me, I have something they will never take again: my voice. My victory was not loud. It was not filled with celebration or applause. My victory was silent, steady, like the ticking of a watch that refuses to stop. And in that silence, I found strength. As I close this chapter of my life, I offer this thought to you, the listener of my story. Never let anyone tell you that what you cherish is worthless. Never let anyone steal your dignity and convince you it was nothing. And above all, never let silence become your prison. Because dignity, once defended, is worth more than all the riches in the world. And that is the truth I will carry with me until my final watch winds down. This is where my story ends, with victory that cost me dearly, but gave me back myself. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between silence and standing up for your dignity? Share your story with me below. And if my journey resonates with you, Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because someone out there might need to hear them.